God is sovereign and God is gracious even when He is totally silent.
Can we trust God's sovereign grace towards us even when He seems to be absent? John Piper answers that question from Ruth 2 in this episode of Light and Truth. This sermon was originally preached at Bethlehem Baptist Church on July 8, 1984.
In verses 1 through 7, we meet Boaz. And we see the character of Ruth, and we sense a merciful providence behind all of this. Look at Boaz. The first thing we learn about Boaz is that he is a relative of Elimelech, Naomi's long-deceased husband. Now, if you were reading this book for the first time, this would crack through like a big opening of dark clouds. Because Naomi had given the impression in chapter 1, there's no point in you coming back here. There's nobody for you to marry to raise up offspring to your husband and to my husband. It's hopeless. You're going to be a widow and childless all your life. And the first thing that happens when they get back is that a man emerges named Boaz, who is a close kin of Elimelech and could fulfill that responsibility of a kinsman redeemer, as they were called. And the crack in the cloud is going to get wider and wider. For example, he is said to be a man of wealth. Moreover, and far more important, he is said to be a man of God. At least that's what I think verse 4 is written to tell us. Why would the storyteller, out of all the possible things that he could write, tell us how Boaz greeted his servants? He says, "And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers," in verse 4, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." I think the reason he took the trouble to insert that little observation is to show us what kind of a man we've got here. If you wanted to know something about the relationship of a businessman and his God, you do not look at what he does on Sunday. You go with him on Monday morning and see how he greets his office staff. You ask how far down God has penetrated into the details of his everyday work life. And so if you want to get a glimpse at the character and the God relationship of Boaz, you just look at the incidentals. The Lord be with you. With you, Boaz. And you catch on to what makes this man tick. He was a man of God. He was saturated with the Lord. And we're going to discover as we move on through this chapter that was not a pious platitude. It will become evident as we move on. Not only do we meet Boaz, but we also meet the character of Ruth in a new way. 3 things about Ruth. First, she takes initiative to fulfill the commitment that she had made to Naomi. Naomi, a destitute widow in a foreign land, Ruth binds herself to her, promises never to leave her, goes back to a foreign land with her, and does not, notice in verse 2, wait for Naomi to say, "Now get out there and make some money." Instead, Ruth takes the initiative and says, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain." Second, Ruth is a very humble woman. She knows how to take initiative without being presumptuous or assuming. Look at verse 7. The way the servants of Boaz report how Ruth came on in the morning. She said, "Pray," which is a Hebrew idiom for please. "Pray, let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." She does not demand a handout. She does not demand to be hired. She does not presume the right even to glean. All she wants is the leftovers, and she doesn't even assume she has a right to pick them up. She asked permission from the servants to pick them up. She is very much like another woman who came to Jesus and said, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs under the table of the children." And Jesus said, "All right, that is great faith." And I think he would say the same thing to Ruth. She knows how to take initiative, but is not pushy or presumptuous. She is meek and humble, even before the servant workers, not to mention Boaz. Third, she is a woman of amazing industry. Verse 7 continues. She has continued from early morning, they say, until now, it's about lunchtime, without resting, even for a moment. And if you drop down to verse 17, we find out what she did for the rest of the day. It says she worked until evening, and when she'd quit working in the field, she beat out the grain, and when she'd beat out the grain, she measured it, and when she'd measured it, she carried it home, and when she'd carried it home, she gave it to Naomi. Sun up to sundown, she was a worker. A woman of initiative, a woman of humility, and a woman of great industry. And there's no doubt that this writer wants us to admire this woman and emulate this woman. And keep your eyes open, because we're going to see these virtues again, and they're going to be very significant in her relationship to God as well as Boaz. There's a third thing in these first 7 verses that we don't want to miss. I called it a sense of merciful providence. Look at verse 3. So she set forth and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to a part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. She happened to come? Really? Well, you don't have to write your theology in every line, do you? You can leave a question unanswered when you're writing a story and expect that the reader will fill it in if he's been catching on. And we've been catching on. We know what the answer is here. Naomi is the one who's going to give the answer in verse 20. She didn't just happen to come to this field. It was the kindness of God who was bringing together Boaz and Ruth. God is sovereign and God is gracious even when He is totally silent. As the proverb says, a man's mind plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. The Lord directed the steps of Ruth to this field. Now let's look at verses 8 and 9 just briefly. Boaz approaches Ruth. He shows her a great kindness, even though she's a foreigner. He gives her what she needs for food. He says, you don't need to go anywhere else to do your gleaning. Do it right here in my field. He gives her protection. He says, I've told these young men, hands off. You're safe. And I've given you, he says, all you want to drink. You don't even have to draw it. Just go and ask the men and they'll give you to drink what they've drawn. So Boaz's wealth and Boaz's godliness is now turning for the welfare of Ruth. And we see great things on the horizon. And now we come to verses 10 through 13, which I think are the most important verses in the chapter. And so we'll focus the rest of our time there. Ruth asks a question to Boaz, and it's a question that turns out to be of immense theological importance. It's a question that you should ask God, and the answer you get back, or the answer you think you get back, is one of the most important things in your life. It says in verse 10, she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me when I'm a foreigner? Ruth knows that she is a Moabite woman. She knows that there are at least two strikes against a foreign woman. And she doesn't resent it. She accepts it, and she does not expect any special treatment at all. Her response when Boaz treats her with kindness is astonishment. She is very different from most people around today. She expresses a great sense of unworthiness. She falls on her face in the field. She bows to the ground. Why, Boaz? Why are you treating me with such kindness? I'm astonished at your kindness. Most people today are astonished just the other way around. They're astonished when they're mistreated. And they consider it a matter of course if they're treated with kindness, because arrogance and pride is the name of the game in American contemporary mindset. Look out for number one, assertiveness. And Ruth knows none of that. Let's read verses 11 and 12. They're very important. Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord recompense you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Now notice, when Boaz, or when Ruth asks Boaz why she is receiving grace from him, Boaz does not answer, "Grace has no conditions." He says, "Because you loved Naomi so much you were willing to leave your mother and father." Now, that raises a question for us. Very important theological question that has a lot to do with the way you live and relate to God. Does the writer of this book want us to understand Naomi's leaving Moab, loving Naomi, coming to Israel as a work by which she earned Boaz's favor and God's favor through Boaz? I don't think so, and I think there are clues right here in these verses to show that that's not the way the writer wants us to think about Ruth's virtue. If Ruth had earned this benefit from Boaz and from God, we would have to think of her somewhat in the category of an employee working for Boaz or for God as an employer. And since she has done something valuable enough to them, they're indebted to give her a fair wage. That's what works means. That's what earning your reward from God means. But this writer gives us a clue in verse 12. He does not want us to think about their relationship in those categories. I think Boaz shifts over to God as the benefactor in verse 12 because he wants her to know that everything that's coming through him and his wealth and his godliness is coming really from God. So he says to her, "The Lord recompense you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Now, there's a new picture here in verse 12. This is not the picture of employee, employer. Good labor, good wage. That's not the image. The image is of a big eagle and a little eaglet flying to take refuge under the eagle's wings. And I think the intention of verse 12 is that the answer to the question why God is going to reward Ruth so highly is that Ruth has come to take refuge under his wings. And he loves to reward people who take refuge under his wings. Not people who try to work for him and give him values that he is then supposed to recompense with appropriate wages. This is a very common and wonderful gospel truth throughout the whole Old Testament. Psalm 57 makes it very explicit. Be merciful to me, O God, be merciful to me, for in thee my soul takes refuge. In the shadow of thy wings I will take refuge. Now the most important word in that verse is the word for, or because. Did you notice? Be merciful to me, God, because I have taken refuge in you. Why should Boaz, or God through Boaz, be merciful to Ruth? Answer, because she has sought refuge in his wings, or under his wings. She has counted God's protection greater protection than all others. She has set her heart upon what God can give rather than what her mother or father could have given back in Moab. So if you come to God pleading God's value as the satisfaction and source of your hope and your joy, instead of pleading your value as the satisfaction of God's hope and the meeting of God's need, then God's unwavering commitment to His own value will engage all His heart to do you good. Now let me say that again, because that's perhaps a complex thought, but it's the heart of my theology, and I think it's the heart of these verses and the whole Bible, and I want our church to be built upon it. So here it is again. If you come to God pleading His value as the source of your need or the fulfillment of your need, what you need from Him, as your hope and your joy, instead of coming to Him pleading your value. Here, I've got something for you to meet your need, to fill your deficiency. Then God's unwavering commitment to His glory and to His name and to His value, which is His highest priority according to Scripture, that commitment will engage all His heart on your behalf, because you have said to Him, your value is what I care about, your value is what I need. So if God ever asks you on the judgment day, and He's going to do this, why should I bless you? This is what you should say to Him. You should say, because I took refuge under your wings. And that's all. Because that exalts Him as an eagle who doesn't need you, whose glory is manifested in His all-sufficiency for you. All He wants to hear on the judgment day is, I needed you, and I chose you above all the satisfactions that were offered me in the world. I didn't stay at home with Mom and Dad in Moab. I took all the risks and went to Palestine. I loved her. I served her, all because I enjoyed being under your wings. We need to ask probably what the relationship is between Ruth's being under the wings of God and Ruth's leaving her father and mother and loving Naomi. Because it was the latter that Boaz said was the reason she was receiving reward. And I think the suggestion that's most likely would be this. Ruth discovered a refuge and a joy and a protection and a fulfillment under the wings of God that was vastly superior than the joy and fulfillment and refuge she could have at home in Moab with Mom and Dad. And therefore she was free. So the relationship between taking refuge under the wings of God and leaving home to serve and love a destitute widow is that, two ways of saying it. The position under the wings of God is the enablement of the love and the freedom. Or to put it another way, the love and the freedom is a result from and an evidence of how much resources you are drawing from the great eagle under whose wings you are abiding. So now back to Ruth's question. Verse 10, why have I found favor? The answer is because you've taken refuge under the wings of God and have found such freedom and such love that it's manifesting itself in your commitment to Naomi. She has not earned Boaz's favor. She has not worked like an employee for God, her employer. Instead, she has glorified them by saying, I need your work. I need the leftovers from your industry. That's what we say to God. I just want the leftovers from your grace. That would satisfy me for an eternity. I know you don't need me, but oh, how I need you. I'm going to let Naomi have the last word here because I've given her a hard time in the past 2 weeks, and that's because I didn't have to go through what she went through. But she's going to shine before we're done. Naomi is waiting. Ruth works the rest of the day. She measures out the grain. She takes it home. And this beautiful little touch, she gives the rest of her lunch to Naomi. That is just beautiful. And then she gives all the grain. And Naomi says, blessed is the man in whose eyes you found favor. Who was it? And Ruth says it was Boaz. And I wish I could have seen the look on Naomi's face. I had forgotten about Boaz. And then in verse 20, she says these wonderful words, which are owing to the same theology that had brought her into despair earlier. Namely, her confidence that it was God who had brought the famine. It was God who had taken her husband. It was God who had taken her sons. That same theology is going to rescue her here, because when she hears that Ruth just happened onto the field of Boaz, she says, blessed be he by the Lord whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. To whom do you give glory, Ruth? That you happened onto the field of the kinsman of Elimelech? God was directing your steps. And now Naomi is delighting in his kindness. She sees it. The clouds have parted wide enough so that even Naomi, with all the tragedy of her life, can recognize that God is for her. He is not against her. And there are great things on the horizon.
This is Light and Truth, God-centered preaching to help you see Christ clearly and treasure Him truly. I'm your host, Dan Kruver. Thank you for listening. On our next episode, John Piper will preach a sermon on righteousness for God's sake, the third sermon in our 4-part series on the book of Ruth titled Behind a Frowning Providence. I hope you'll join us. For more resources, visit desiringgod.org.